There's an old Haitian proverb that says, "No one hears the sound of a wooden bell, and no one hears the voice of the poor." It's no surprise that this proverb comes to us out of centuries of Haitian experience of colonialism. Their transition from foreign rule towards democratic self-governance, well, it hasn't gone very well, and it certainly hasn't progressed in a straight line. So the poor of Haiti, even in 2023, would still say that their voices are not meaningfully heard. Now, you've heard me say in past sermons that most of the major world religions were formed in a time of rebellion, usually a rebellion of the poor against the ruling richer class, or the rebellion of slaves against captors or invaders. There is a way of reading the Jesus narrative that's a nice message, a message of love and peace that encourages people to be long-suffering, if not martyrs, to sell all you have and give it to the poor. But most historical Jesus scholars also see a tradition sort of in between the lines of the Gospels that might be older than that really sweet saccharine Jesus that shows us that the historical character was probably a revolutionary who was radically opposed to the invasion of the Roman Empire and opposed to his peers who had made some rather unsavory alliances with the Roman Empire, which, frankly, makes crucifixion a lot easier to understand. For Rome to execute an insurrectionist makes a certain amount of sense. Killing a preacher for teaching people to be loving and generous, that just isn't something governments usually pay any attention to. Buddha also taught that life is full of suffering, but there is an anti-monarch rejection of the ruling class in Buddhist tradition as well. Muhammad, unlike the tradition of the opulent caliphs who followed him, Muhammad lived in poverty by choice. People who didn't know who he was when they saw him thought that he was a homeless beggar. He dressed that way and lived in a very small house in order to identify with the poor. Just as Jesus said that it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God, Muhammad said the poor will enter paradise 500 years before the rich. In the modern era, those of us who try to articulate a spiritual worldview often talk about not just giving alms to the poor, don't just give out handouts, but actually try to change the circumstances of the poor so that the poor can work and be compensated fairly, so that they have a voice in how their government is run. That voice is typically expressed in a ballot box by the creation of a democratic government, so that, in the hope that we will end up with a government that treats the rich and the poor, the privileged and the underprivileged in basically the same way. The kingdom of God, that phrase that Jesus uses so often in the Gospels, that's really a description of a civilization that lives by the standards of God, which is justice and mercy. So a Christian employer who puts out a box of free canned goods and some frozen turkeys before Thanksgiving so that the low-salaried workers can pick up some free food to have a holiday meal, that boss has confused charity with justice. The employer should be paying the staff enough to buy their own dinner and maintain their dignity at the same time. Now, most of us of a certain age were expected to read George Orwell's 1945 novel, Animal Farm, when we were middle school or high school. It's generally believed that Orwell wanted to write a parody of communism, which starts out with high ideals of equality, but quickly evolves into a kind of abusive totalitarianism. When I look at it today, I'm not so sure that the shoe fits any better on the communist foot than it fits on the Western democracy foot. In the novel, the animals on a farm have a successful revolution. They get rid of the human farmers. Then they hold a kind of constitutional convention in the barnyard. And the animals come up with 7 laws to guide their new farm. It included such things as no animal shall wear clothes, no animal shall sleep in a bed, no animal shall drink alcohol. But it concluded with the firm affirmation that all animals are equal. The 7 laws were publicly displayed, but as the novel proceeds and we see how the pigs manage to take control, they're a little more intelligent, they're more inventive, they begin to reward themselves for their extra responsibility with special privileges. And then new words start to appear on the painted sign on the barn wall, like it used to say, no animal shall sleep in a bed, and then it says, no animal shall sleep in a bed with sheets. But the one that we all remember the most clearly is the change from all animals are equal to all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. Our nation's founders, sick of rigid European class structures and with heads full of French philosophy, wrote in the Declaration of Independence that we are all equal. Well, it was 1776, so they said all men are equal. But trust me, they didn't mean that either. White men were a lot more equal than black men. They penned these words about equality in a culture that still defended not just the institution of slavery, but the institution of indentured servanthood, which was like a few years of slavery, and which, both in practice and in law, they still regarded women as having little more than a supportive role to play in society. And so, in the name of liberty, equality, and freedom, they wrote a constitution that was riddled with compromises. They were inspired by this ideal society defined by equality, but they felt that they had to cave in to the reality of their day in which black Africans were still slaves, poor Europeans were indentured servants, all women were almost without rights, and children could be made to work either on the family farm or sent into industry. There was at that time, though, already a vigorous debate about the legitimacy of slavery. And so the larger slaveholding states wouldn't join the Union unless they could be assured that their institution of slavery couldn't be eradicated by a majority vote, because they knew they would lose a majority vote. The slaveholding states were agricultural, and so they had smaller populations than the more industrialized northern states. So the makeup of the legislative branch was itself a compromise. The Congress, the number of people in Congress, is based on the number of people living in a state so that there's a representative for a certain block of people. Right now, though, just for example, Alaska, North Dakota, and South Dakota only have one member of Congress because so few people live there. California has 52. Texas has 38. So the balance of that different number of legislators was struck by creating a Senate in which every single state gets 2 senators. North Dakota and South Dakota only have one member of Congress, but they have 2 senators. California has 52 members of Congress, but just 2 senators. In the 18th century, this protected a state like Georgia from being ruled by a larger state like New York. But in our time, it means that a senator from California represents 20 million citizens, and a senator from North Dakota represents fewer than 400,000. Of course, our founders would never have conceived of a state with 40 million people in it. There were fewer than 3 million people in the 13 colonies when the Constitution was written. The compromise they made in the late 18th century to keep the slave-owning states in the Union has become a matter of gross underrepresentation of larger states and absurd overrepresentation in smaller states, which allows a small state like my home state of Kentucky to send both Mitch McConnell and Rand Paul to the Senate. Now, I can see why my peers in Kentucky would want to get those two people out of the state, however they had to do it. But it gives them a disproportionate amount of influence in government. This is not one person, one vote. This is not really democracy. We can say that all Americans are equal, but people who live in the Dakotas and Alaska, they're about 50 times more equal than the people who live in California, at least so far as having a voice in the Senate goes. And oddly enough, you can't find huge, impoverished Black and Hispanic neighborhoods in the Dakotas or in Alaska. That kind of skewed proportion effectively means that the poor in our most populated states, really, they can't be heard as easily as you can hear the sound of a wooden bell. The second compromise enshrined in our Constitution is the creation of the wholly and exclusively American institution that we call the Electoral College. When we vote for a president, we don't just add up the votes and declare the person with the most votes the winner of the election. In fact, two of our presidents in this century lost the popular vote but still became president because of the skewed way that the Electoral College works. Both George W. Bush and Donald Trump failed to gain a majority vote. You hear people in our area here in Missouri saying that there's really no reason to even cast a vote in a presidential election, because if the vote is always divided, and it's close, it can be 51% red and 49% blue, but the winner gets all of the electoral votes. And in Missouri, that's almost always a Republican candidate. In this century, even though the vote is statistically close, the Republican candidate is assured of getting all of Missouri's electoral votes. That's why we never have presidential candidates showing up in Missouri to do much campaigning. In a recent election, 49.3% of Missourians voted Democratic, but the Republicans still got all 10 of our electoral votes. 48 states in this country do it exactly that way, with only Maine and Nebraska dividing their votes proportionally. Because of this, voting in either reliably red or reliably blue states means next to nothing. It's only the swing states that actually choose a president, and there's just not very many of those. I'm saying all of this exactly 1 year before our next presidential election because you're going to be treated to a lot of talk in the news over the next year about gerrymandering, redistricting, and dozens, if not hundreds, of state laws intended to suppress voting among poor, immigrant, and minority populations. For those of us who are white, straight, middle-class, native-born Americans, all of this can sound like buzzing of talking heads in the background. People like me rarely feel marginalized. We don't feel in any existential way that our government is set up to discriminate against us. Now, I'm a liberal in a red state, but for most of my life, when I've called one of our senators, the senator calls me back. And when I have shown up for a demonstration in Washington, D.C., even our Republican representatives make time to have a private conversation with me. Now, they assiduously avoid everything that I say, but I can't say that I don't have a voice. I have a a loud, irritating, raspy, but largely ineffective voice. But it's still my voice. Having had a weekly political column in the region's newspaper back in the day when people actually read newspapers, gave me a megaphone when it came to being in touch with our elected officials. But if we are actually spiritual people, defined by a compassionate worldview, we can't ignore the suppression of the voice of the poor and minorities just because we happen to not be either poor or a minority. Hard-fought-for civil liberties are being eroded or blatantly taken away from us. Last summer, women lost control of their own reproductive lives, and many conservatives have the marriage rights of the gay community in their sights. And you shouldn't have to be either a woman or gay to be pretty exercised about this. As a straight man who advocates for gay civil rights, as a man who advocates for the equality of women, I and people like me cannot be satisfied by simply being allies for the oppressed minorities. We white liberals need to give up on seeing ourselves as saviors of the black race. Men do not need to constantly act like we're in leadership roles in the feminist movement, and straight people need to promote gay leaders of the gay community and not try to be heroes in our own right. Now, I don't regret any of the years that I spent in publicly advocating for the poor, for minorities, the LGBT+ community, but it's not my voice that needs to be heard louder. Those of us in the privileged majority need to make space for the voices of the marginalized. We don't need to play as saviors and heroes. We need to applaud the legitimate leadership that is emerging in each of these groups. After 50 years of civil rights and equality speeches with all of us liberal preachers, journalists, and politicians, still, when you look at our Congress in 2023, this Congress has more women than any previous Congress, but they still make up only 1/4 of the Senate and the Congress, and last time I checked, they make up more than half of the population. Our current Congress has more openly gay members than any previous Congress, but that's still just 13 folks. I saw more than 13 gay people on stage at the local theater recently. That hardly represents the actual size of their community. More than half of the members of our Congress are also millionaires, and very few have ever been what they could call poor. All of the efforts at voter suppression are intended to have the effect of keeping our Congress primarily white, male, straight, and rich, and that is not the America that I know. We've taken some serious steps backwards in the past few years. I suppose it was naive to hope that progress always goes in a straight line, but we must not give up. I no longer pray for the serenity to accept the things that I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. I think it's time for a new prayer. I pray for the strength to change the things that I cannot accept, and I hope that you do too.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.